Welcome back. Welcome to this module, which will focus on the epilogue in the Gospel of John and will answer the really striking question, I think, why 153 fish? You know, at the end of John's Gospel, there's that magnificent post-resurrection scene where the disciples are back at the Sea of Galilee, they're fishing, they've been hard at it all night, they've been working through the night and they've caught nothing. Come daybreak, there's a stranger on the shore and he yells out, "Children, have you caught any fish?" And they say, "Nope, not a thing." And he says, "Throw your nets over the right side and you will make a catch." Peter doesn't believe at first, but he goes ahead and does it. And then when they throw the nets in, the nets that they haul back in are full to the bursting. It says in John 21 verse 11, "So Simon Peter went over and dragged the net ashore full of 153 large fish." Now, why 153 fish? Why is that specified here? You know, I gave a homily once on this gospel in a parish, and a man came up afterwards and says, "It always said that in the gospel, 153 fish. Did they count each one out one by one? How did they get the number 153? So I want to explain that in this module. No, they didn't count them out one by one. That misses the power of the symbolism. So I want to explain why there are 153 fish mentioned at the end of John's Gospel in the epilogue. Now, you may think, why have I fast forwarded to the epilogue? Well, we're running out of time in this course. There's no way I can do everything that I want to do in these modules. I'm going to let the reading assignments fill in all the details in the Gospel of John. So I'm going to rely on your reading assignments to provide you with all of that information. I want to focus here on this, what I think interesting question is, why 153 fish in the epilogue? Now, I keep calling it the epilogue. It is clearly designated as the epilogue in the Gospel of John. Did someone else write it? We saw in the Gospel of Mark the longer ending was definitely written by someone long after Mark, maybe even 200 years later. Someone else wrote the longer ending that is biblical, it's canonical, it's scripture, it's attached to the Gospel of Mark, but it wasn't written by the hand of Mark. Is that what is going on here in the Gospel of John? Let me answer my own question up front by saying no. The beloved disciple definitely wrote the epilogue. Well then, why has it been questioned? Why have some people thought that it was not written by the beloved disciple? Why do they think that it was tacked on at the end of the Gospel of John? Let me show you why they think that, and then again we'll see an answer for why this was in fact written by the beloved disciple. The reason many scholars, some scholars I should say, question who wrote the epilogue is because in the Gospel of John there will be 7 signs throughout the Gospel. John structures his Gospel around these 7 signs. And here I put a list of the 7 signs that appear in the Gospel of John. Each sign gives us a little different insight into the person of Christ, into the mystery of Christ. Each sign tells us something invaluable about the person of Christ, and yet when you look at all 7 together, one could say that these 7 tell us everything. They tell us everything we need to know about the person of Christ. They give us the full picture in the Gospel of John of the person of Christ. Remember, 7 is the number of fullness. 7 is the number of perfection, of completion. And so in the Gospel of John, we are given these 7 different signs, each one providing a different insight into the person of Christ. Okay, now I'm going to have to let, again, the reading assignments fill you in on the meaning of each of these different 7 signs. But there's just one that I can't resist pointing out. Let's look at the first one, the wedding scene of Cana, at Cana. It's in John chapter 2 that we have this, but I think what's really interesting is verse 6 of chapter 2, Gospel of John, where it says there were 6 stone water jars there for Jewish ceremonial washings, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus told them, fill the jars with water, so they filled them to the brim. 6 stone water jars, each holding 30 gallons, filled to the brim. That means 180 gallons of wine. I don't care how big your party is. Nobody needs 180 gallons of wine extra at the end of the party just to sort of tide the guests over. 180 gallons of wine. You can see here that this represents the fullness. Christ came to give us the fullness of life, the fullness of His Spirit, the fullness, the richness of a joy that comes from following Christ. Christ came to give us life here and now, not just for later on. Yes, definitely for later on, but it starts here and now, and following Him, becoming His disciple, it leads to the fullness of life, a rich life, here and now, and that is signified by these 6 stone water jars, each with 30 gallons, 180 gallons of wine. The abundance that comes from following Christ, from being one of His disciples, that is one of the meanings communicated in this first sign. Again, I'm going to let the reading assignments fill you in with the rest of them. But notice we have 7 different signs here. The wedding at Cana, then there's a healing at Cana, there's another healing miracle, then there's the multiplication of the loaves. It's actually called a sign in verse 26 of chapter 6. Then in John 9, the healing of the man born blind. The raising of Lazarus is called a sign in John 12:18. And then the resurrection. Now it happens in John 20, but it's actually called a sign in John 2, verses 18 to 19. That's where Jesus predicts His resurrection. That will be a sign. Actually, it's the fullness of the signs. It's the most complete sign that occurs in the Gospel of John. But here we have these 7 signs, each one opening up a new vista into the person of Christ, each one delivering a new teaching about Christ. We have these 7, and then we have the epilogue with that miraculous catch of fish. That blows the symbolism. It's an 8th sign in the epilogue. It blows the whole 7 perfection, completion, fullness. That's why some scholars thought that, well, maybe the epilogue was tacked on by somebody else, because there goes the neat symbolism of 7 throughout the Gospel of John when we have this 8th miracle tacked on at the very end in the epilogue. Now, I think there is really a very easy, simple, convincing answer to this. Really, the epilogue, it doesn't tell us anything new about Jesus. The resurrection especially tells us everything that we need to know about Jesus. And in the Gospel of John, the other signs tell us everything, really, that we need to know about the person of Christ. In the epilogue, we don't see a new insight into the person of Christ. Instead, it's a new insight into the mission of the disciples. The epilogue, this miraculous catch of fish, it's really not so much about Christ. We don't learn anything really new about Him that we haven't read about earlier in John. Instead, we are given a rich insight into what the nature of the ministry is going to be now, what the role of the disciples will be. Really, the epilogue is more about the mission of the disciples and insights into discipleship and mission rather than the person of Christ. So I do think the epilogue was written by the beloved disciple. I do think it came from his hand. I do think it fits beautifully, magnificently with the Gospel of John, and I don't think that it blows the symbolism of the 7 signs that preceded it, because the miraculous catch of fish is not so much about the person of Christ as it is providing insights into the nature of discipleship. Okay, so if the epilogue is established as belonging completely to the Gospel of John, time now for me to answer the question that we do come across, or the question that does arise after reading the epilogue: why 153 fish? Now, lots of different lots of different church fathers have given different answers, lots of scholars. If you look in the commentaries, you can find different answers. As you well know by now, there's no one definitive answer to a biblical verse normally. I'm going to give you a different take on it, and it's one among many. I think it's really rich and interesting, but I don't for a second want you to think that this is the definitive word on why 153 fish. There are other explanations, but let me pursue one that I think is I think it's interesting, and I think you'll appreciate this. To understand the number symbolism, 153 fish, we have to know a little bit about gematria. Gematria was an ancient rabbinical, Jewish exegetical procedure. It was used in early Christianity, and gematria is basically number symbolism. Now, I don't want you to think that we're veering off into astrology or crazy stuff like that. This was one rabbinical exegetical technique, and we'll see it in other parts of the New Testament as well. Gematria is basically understanding that every single letter in the Hebrew alphabet and in the Greek alphabet also had a numerical value attached to it. Now, this is not the way our alphabet works today, so that's why it seems strange to us. When we're little kids, we learn A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and the rest of it. We don't learn any numbers, we just learn the letters of the alphabet. But in the Hebrew alphabet and in the Greek alphabet, every letter of the alphabet also had a numerical value attached to it. So here we see a chart. Look at the Greek alphabet. Notice alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, zeta, eta, theta, iota, kappa, lambda, mu, nu, xi. Okay, I didn't do that to impress you. Really, it's easy to learn the Greek alphabet. Anybody that joins a sorority or fraternity in college learns the Greek alphabet. I mean, they learn to reel off the Greek alphabet when they're half sober, and you might be wondering how I know this, but let me just tell you, I wasn't born a priest, okay? So learning the Greek alphabet, it's not hard. It pays rich dividends in terms of even using exegetical tools. But look at the Greek alphabet here and see how each one has a number assigned to it. So alpha is 1, beta is 2, gamma is 3, so on and so on. Notice at iota it's 10, kappa it's 20, lambda is 30, mu is 40, and so on. Then down at rho it becomes 100, and sigma 200, tau 300, and so on. So every letter in the Greek alphabet had a number assigned to it as well. Same thing with the Hebrew, and you can see that over there with the Hebrew alphabet. So this was really not at all uncommon back then. When little kids learned their alphabets, they also learned the numbers assigned to their alphabet. So this is the basis of gematria, knowing that every letter of the alphabet has a number assigned to it as well. Now, there are further refinements to gematria. Sometimes just counting the number of syllables or words in the Bible will yield some information. That too is a part of gematria, counting words or syllables in the text. Sometimes the number of times a particular word occurs within a given text, they will use that as a springboard to other exegetical insights. I'll show you how this comes into play as well. But really there are three components that we want to concern ourselves with here when it comes to gematria. Understanding that every letter in Greek and Hebrew had a number assigned to it, and then also realizing there was a practice of counting the number of syllables or words in a chapter or in a book of the Bible, and then also the number of times any given word might occur. They would use that, and then they would develop some interpretations based on that kind of counting. These three techniques were all combined when interpreting the scriptures by the early Jewish rabbis, and we see it even in the Christian New Testament. You know perhaps the most famous number of all, In the book of Revelation 666, understanding gematria reveals the identity of 666. Let's do that now. Just as a little excursus, a little aside, I want to show you how gematria yields 666 and the identity of that number. Okay, using this chart, let's calculate the number of the beast, the number 666, and it says in the book of Revelation, if you have just a little bit of wisdom, you can calculate the number of the beast. What that wisdom referred to was, as long as you understand gematria and the principles of it, you can easily calculate the number of the beast. It was not that hard to figure out. Okay, so who is the beast? Who is the identity of 666? It's Caesar Nero. Caesar Nero. Now, the way to add this up is Nero's name in Greek, Caesar Nero, was Kaiser Neron. That's how it would have been written in Greek, Kaiser Neron. Now, the Romans, Nero's obviously the Caesar of the Romans. The Romans spoke Latin and they spoke Greek. So they had to make one more move here to keep it somewhat obscure so that the Romans wouldn't figure it out easily. They had to use the Hebrew alphabet. Again, the Romans spoke Greek, but they didn't speak Hebrew. And so this was subversive literature to call the Caesar the beast in the book of Revelation. Obviously, whoever wrote that, they would hunt down and kill if they could. And so it's kept a little bit obscure from Roman eyes because the Romans didn't speak Hebrew. Greek they had, Hebrew they didn't. So they put this into, if you put Kaiser Neron into the Hebrew alphabet, look what happens. Okay, so the Hebrew letters are QSR, NR, WN. So add it up. Quof on the Hebrew alphabet's 100, Samek is 60, Resh is 200, Nun is 50, Vau used for the W is 6. So Kaiser Neron in Hebrew, using the Hebrew alphabet, is 100 plus 60 plus 200 plus 50 plus 200 plus 6 plus 50, 666. So once you have the identity, once you have an understanding of gematria, you have the identity of the beast of Revelation 666, which was Caesar Nero, the Caesar who was the paranoid, delusional, fanatic. Really, he really does rank up there with among the greatest villains of all time, and he's portrayed as such in the book of Revelation. So we saw in Revelation 13, the beast overall depicts the military might of Rome, but of course the Caesar commands the army. The Caesar commands the military might of Rome, and so one of the heads of the beast was definitely Nero. Okay, with this understanding of gematria, we can easily see that 666 refers to Caesar, Nero. Look at Revelation 13 just one more time. It says in Revelation 13:3 that one of the heads on the beast seemed to have been mortally wounded, but this mortal wound was healed. I mentioned that in an earlier module that, again, there was this myth going around that Nero was just so wicked he wouldn't die, so they were afraid he'd come back. That's how evil that man was. People couldn't believe the good news that this guy was finally dead. So that explains Revelation 13:3. Revelation 13:4, who can fight against the beast? Again, no one could challenge the military might of Rome. 13:5, the mouth uttering boasts and blasphemies. We've seen again before that the Caesars insisted on proclaiming themselves as God, which was obviously blasphemy to any Jew or Christian. Then in verse 13:7, the beast was allowed to wage war and conquer the holy ones. Again, the holy ones, Peter and Paul in particular, were both killed, executed by Emperor Nero. I've mentioned that before. Then notice 13:10, anyone destined to be slain by the sword will be slain. Again, Nero had to commit suicide by the sword. His generals had had enough of his wickedness, and so they force him to commit suicide. He kills himself by the sword. So again, there's a reference to Nero there in 13:10. And then 13:17, no one could buy or sell without the stamped image of the beast's name. So again, here's a coin that contains the image of Nero. No one could buy or sell without this image of Nero on the coin. You had to use this coin to purchase. Using this coin meant you were in collusion with the Roman Empire. And remember what Roman Empire did to the church. You can see why. The author of Revelation is just abhorred that anybody would be walking around carrying money like this in their pockets. Money with the face of the beast on it. Money with the face of Nero, the Caesar, on it. The Caesar who had executed Peter and Paul. Okay, so here's gematria at work in the book of Revelation, especially decoding 666. But it wasn't just, in biblical things like this. At Pompeii, they found some graffiti that basically says, I love the girl whose number is 545. So again, gematria was a pretty common understanding if you had Greek and Hebrew. This was not as esoteric as it seems to us. It seems a little like, I don't know, Scientology or number symbolism or New Age. I mean, it might seem like that to us because, again, our alphabet doesn't function like this. We don't have numerical values attached to the letters of our alphabet, but back then it was very common. And we see this even among, I don't know, teenage graffiti. I love the girl whose number is 545. Again, people could have, if they wanted to, if they really felt like it, they could have decoded 545 just as easily as we did 666. It'd be like initials, people write initials in trees and they put their names and initials up on, graffiti on walls when they fall in love and they have to express their love, and that goes all the way back to Pompeii. But they used gematria instead of initials. Back then, at least in Pompeii in this example, somebody loves a girl whose number is 545. Again, if their parents came across and found that, it wouldn't be too hard for the parents to figure out who 545 was if they really felt like it. Okay, with this basic understanding of gematria, let's turn back now to the epilogue of John and see if we can figure out why 153 fish. Now, using gematria, there are two different phrases that could add up to 153 fish, and a guy by the name of Helmut Kress came up with two different possibilities. 153 is the numerical value of the phrase the church of love in Hebrew. That's kahal hahava, the church of love. If you take that phrase in Hebrew, kahal hahava, and you add up the letters, you get 153. Now that's beautiful. And it does just beautifully signify the mission of the apostles. The apostles are meant to go out and create the church of love, hauling all men and women into the net, hauling them ashore safely into the net, creating the church of love. I think that's a beautiful theology. And it's not wrong. I don't want to say that that's not wrong, that this truly is the mission of the 12 apostles. They go out after the resurrection and they create, build up, pull in everyone that they can, thereby creating the church of love, kahal hahava. But Helmut Kress notes that there's another phrase that works, and it might work even a little better, and it can explain some other things in the Gospel of John. And his other phrase is children of God in Hebrew, Banai Elohim. This also adds up to 153. That Hebrew phrase, Banai Elohim, adds up to 153. And this too is what the disciples are to do. They are to gather all of the children of God into the net of the church. They are to call absolutely everyone, to seek out everyone, and to call them, to haul them in, literally, into the nets, into the church, to invite all of the children of God into the church. This is surely the mission of the disciples as well. And I think this phrase works a little better, to see that Banai Elohim, the children of God, perhaps this is the best explanation for 153 fish. This is what the 153 signify, all the children of God. And the reason why I like this phrase is because it explains what's going on earlier in verse 5 of John 21, when Jesus calls out to them from the shore, "Children, have you anything to eat?" Now, that really is kind of an odd thing to say. I mean, they're all grown men, obviously. Why does Jesus call them children? Especially, these weren't strangers. After everything they'd been through, after everything they'd seen, after everything they'd witnessed, why would Jesus today address them as children? Children, have you anything to eat? Well, again, if the 153 signifies the children of God, we see a connection there. And so I think understanding, decoding 153 as the phrase children of God, I think that sheds light on that strange address from Jesus. It also explains earlier in John chapter 1, verse 12, when the gospel says that he gives power to everyone to become children of God. So that's how his gospel begins, verse 12, chapter 1. And then we see this at the end with this children of God symbolized by the number 153. Now I hasten to add that this only works with the Hebrew alphabet. John's writing his gospel in Greek. Doesn't work, those number tallies don't work with the Greek alphabet. They only work with the Hebrew. So John has to be thinking in Hebrew while writing Greek. Now, is that getting a bit far-fetched, Father Joe? Is this kind of kind of going out on a limb too far to think that John could be thinking in Hebrew and writing in Greek? Well, no, I don't think so. I wouldn't have taken you this far down this road. I think John is thinking about, the reason he's thinking in Hebrew is because he's thinking of a certain Old Testament text, a certain Hebrew text. And let's look at this now. This explains why John could be thinking in Hebrew while he's writing in Greek, because he has a Hebrew Old Testament text in mind, and it would be Ezekiel 47, verses 1 to 12. Ezekiel 47, verses 1 through 12, it's that magnificent vision of Ezekiel where he sees water coming out of the temple. So feel free to pause me right now or at any point here in the next couple of seconds and read Ezekiel 47, 1 to 12 to yourself. So you can pause me now or just keep listening and I'll recount basically the miracle, or the vision I should say. It's that vision that Ezekiel sees where water is flowing out of the temple, and at first it's just ankle deep, and then he wades, he measures off 1,000 cubits, and then it's knee deep, then he wades, measures off another 1,000, and it's waist deep, and then he measures off another 1,000, then it's a rushing river that is just too deep to cross. It's a magnificent vision of this new life coming out of the Jerusalem temple. Remember, the Jerusalem temple is the source of the presence of God for the Jews. It was the source it's where they kept the covenant. It was the place of animal sacrifice. It was the place of God's presence on earth. And so Ezekiel sees this renewed temple serving as really the font of life, with this magnificent vision of water coming out. It becomes so torrential, so deep that it just sweeps away everything in its path. Now, what I think is really interesting is if you keep reading and then get to verse 10, and the water's coming out and it's creating this river, and along the banks there are trees that are growing, and that it depicts the scene around this vision. But notice at verse 10, fishermen, already a connection back to John with the disciples throwing their nets. Fishermen in the Gospel of John, I'll develop that a little bit more. But notice in Ezekiel, verse 10, fishermen shall be standing along it from En-Gedi to En-Eglaim, spreading their nets there. Its kind of fish shall be like those of the great sea, very numerous. Now, there's a connection here between the Gospel of John and the disciples casting their nets, fishermen casting their nets and hauling in this great catch of 153, but I want to make the connections even stronger for you. Again, using gematria. Notice, in Ezekiel, we're given two place names, En-Gedi and En-Eglaim. Now, if you, again, invoke gematria, the number for En-Gedi is 17. The symbolic number of En-Eglaim is 153. It gets even richer. 153 is known as the triangular number of 17, meaning if you add up all the numbers between 1 and 17, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, add all that up and you get 153, which is the symbolic number of En-Eglaim. 153 reappears in the Gospel of John. The word En-Gedi in the book of Ezekiel is the 153rd word in chapter 47. So chapter 47, you count 153 words in, and you land at En-Gedi. So again, you might think, now this is just a stretch, but let me tell you, the scribes back then, they counted every word. It's how they charged for their manuscripts. It's how they made sure that they hadn't made a mistake. We don't do this. We have computers, that would kind of sort all this out for us. But back then they had to do all this by hand. And so they would have counted these words. It would have been a common practice back then among the scribal class to do such things. So it sounds like a stretch to us, but it really wasn't back then. Now, again, the symbolic number for Gedi is 17, which is also the symbolic name or the symbolic number for the Hebrew word korban, which is sacrifice. 17 is the symbolic number of Gedi. 17 is the symbolic number of the Hebrew word korban, which means sacrifice. Sacrifice was what took place inside the Jerusalem temple. It was those animal sacrifices that produced the new life for the Jews before the time of Christ. Now maybe we can see what John is really up to in the epilogue here. It's really a Christian reinterpretation of Ezekiel 47, 1 to 12. Whereas before, for Ezekiel, the temple was the source of life, now Jesus is the source of life. Whereas before it was the korban, the sacrifice in the Jerusalem temple, that was the source of life. For Christians, it's the sacrifice of Jesus Christ that is life-giving. And so we see what's going on here in the epilogue perhaps now. It's really a Christian reinterpretation, a Christian reimagining, a Christian transposition of Ezekiel 47, 1 to 12 into a Christian key. The temple is no more. It is no longer the source of life. The source of life now is Jesus Christ and the life that he gives us through his sacrifice. This is the source of life for Christians now. You see, in Ezekiel 47, it was the temple and the life-giving water that came out of the temple that made them children of God. But in John's epilogue, now we know what makes the children of God. It's the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, and it is all those who believe in his name are now given the power to become children of God, and it is the disciples who go to gather up all of the children of God, bringing them all safely into the nets of the church. It's magnificent what's going on in John's epilogue. Again, I think we see now why maybe it was John the Elder who wrote the Gospel of John, why it was John the Elder who was the beloved disciple. Again, somebody had to have a very sophisticated understanding of the temple and also of the texts of the Old Testament. A Hebrew priest, a Jewish high priest, would have been that well versed. He would have spent his life immersed in the texts of the Old Testament. And I'm not saying that John the son of Zebedee wouldn't have known about the text from Ezekiel, but look at what the sophistication that is woven into the epilogue. It seems to me the work of a very sophisticated Jewish, even high priest, who could take Ezekiel 47 and turn it into a Christian reinterpretation that is magnificently depicted in the epilogue of the Gospel of John. There are some other connections between Ezekiel 47 and the Gospel of John that I'd like to point out now. Let's look at John chapter 7. We're going to really focus on 38, but let's look at verse 37 and 38. So John chapter 7, verse 37, on the last and greatest day of the feast, Jesus stood up and exclaimed, "Let anyone who thirsts come to me and drink." So again, we've got connections to water there, as we saw in the Temple of Jerusalem. "Let anyone who thirsts come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture says, rivers of living water will flow from within him." Now, this is a really puzzling citation for a couple of reasons. First of all, it says in verse 38, "Whoever believes in me, as Scripture says, rivers of living water will flow within him." Scripture says that nowhere. That's nowhere in the Old Testament. John makes it sound like, well, this is just some ordinary quotation from Scripture. He says, "Whoever believes in me, as Scripture says, rivers of living water will flow from within him." That's not in Scripture. And also, you see this in your English text, rivers of living water will flow from within him. Now, that's not a very accurate translation. The Greek word there is kolias, which means breast. So, technically, in Greek, it's rivers of living water will flow from his breast. Now, it seems like it's getting even stranger. What is John thinking of here? Well, I think John is really not so much thinking about Scripture as he is the temple. Or let me put it this way. He's thinking about Scripture all right, but he's doing it in a very imaginative way. Let's go back to Ezekiel 47, and we'll see what John was thinking about. He was really thinking about the temple. Now hang on to your notepads, and I will explain all of this, but Ezekiel 47, let's go back there. He's really thinking about Ezekiel verse 1 in chapter 47 when he says that living water will flow from my breast. Let me show you how all this fits together. Okay, starting at verse 1, chapter 47. "Then he brought me back to the entrance of the temple. I saw water flowing out from beneath the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the facade of the temple was toward the east. The water flowed down from the southern side of the temple, south of the altar." Now, to understand how all of this fits together, you have to understand this. The Jews basically thought of the Jerusalem temple as resembling a human body. The Jews thought of the temple as, in fact, reimagining the body of Adam. That there was a really rich Jewish rabbinical tradition with just the most mind-blowing spiritual insights that came from their understanding the temple as a human body, even the body of Adam. Once Adam died, Adam continued to live on with the Jews, among the Jews, as depicted in the Temple of Jerusalem itself. So you can even see here that the temple resembles a human figure. You've got the head up there where the Holy of Holies is, and then you've got the sides of the temple, and you've got the courtyards. It's even laid out somewhat resembling a human body, and a lot of the rabbis made a lot of really beautiful spiritual hay out of understanding and comparing the temple in Jerusalem to a human body and to even that of the body of Adam. Now, notice up on the side, it looks like there's a shoulder here in the temple, and there is up in the corner there the shoulder of the side of the temple. This is what I want to focus on. In Ezekiel 47:1, it says that he saw water coming out from the south end of the temple, of the threshold of the temple. Now, the word for the south end of the temple, the south end of the threshold of the temple, is katef in Hebrew. Katef in Hebrew also means something else. It refers to the south end of the threshold of the temple, but it also refers to shoulder. And you can even see here it looks like a shoulder. This is where Ezekiel saw the water coming out of the Jerusalem temple. He saw it coming out of the shoulder of the temple, out of the katef of the temple. Right here at this location is where Ezekiel has his vision of this life-giving water coming out of the shoulder of the temple, out of the south side of the threshold of the temple. Both south side of the threshold and shoulder are the same word in Hebrew, katef. Now guess what? Katef in Greek is what John uses in his gospel, kolios. The word that Jesus says when he stands up and says in John chapter 7:38, whoever believes in me, living water will well up from within him. Really what John is saying is living water will well up from his shoulder. And we see here a direct connection to the vision in Ezekiel. Ezekiel sees water welling up, coming out of the south side of the temple, out of the katef of the temple, out of the shoulder of the temple. So John is really thinking about the Jerusalem temple here when he's writing this scripture about Jesus. Jesus replaces the temple. Jesus is the new temple. The life that the temple used to give, now that comes from Jesus. And so back in John chapter 7, verse 38, when Jesus stands up and says, rivers of living water will flow from within him, it's really rivers of living water will flow from his shoulder. Just again, we have a direct connection to the vision Ezekiel sees, where he sees water coming out of literally the shoulder of the Jerusalem temple. So John 7:38 recaptures the meaning of Jesus as the new temple. Jesus replaces the temple, and Jesus is now the source of life. Whereas the temple used to be the source of life, now it is Jesus, belief in Jesus, who is the source of life, and Jesus is the one who gives life-giving waters that Ezekiel saw coming out of the temple. It also sheds further light on John 19:34 when a soldier lances his side and we see blood and water coming out. Now, again, there's so many layers of meaning here, but blood and water, life-giving water coming out of the side of Christ, it's practically up where this shoulder was. Again, where the life-giving waters came out of the temple, life-giving waters now come out of even the body of the crucified Lord because of his sacrifice, his korban, his life-giving sacrifice. He replaces the temple. And now because of his sacrifice, he's the source of life for all of us. And life-giving waters now no longer come from the temple, but they well up and come to us out of the saving sacrifice of Jesus Christ. It's magnificent theology. You have to agree. Okay, one last point that I would like to make using gematria. And did the beloved disciple write into his gospel a hidden telling reference about himself? We know that the name of the beloved disciple was John from tradition. Again, scholars are divided about exactly which John was it, but I don't think anybody believes that anybody besides John wrote the Gospel of John. The disagreement is over the exact identity of that John, but still the Gospel of John was obviously written by John. And John in Hebrew is Yehohanan. Yehohanan. Now if you take the numerical tally of Yehohanan using gematria, you come up with 129. The symbolic number of Yehohanan in the Hebrew alphabet is 129. Well, guess what the 129th word is in the Gospel of John? Yes, the disciple whom Jesus loved. So 129 words in, we have reference to the beloved disciple. Again, perhaps that's a numerical signature of the author of the Gospel of John. Again, I don't want to make too much out of this. It's not the standard way of doing everything exegetical today, but I think that it raises some interesting insights, and it can be a valuable tool when used in moderation. Again, we're learning how to exegete the scriptures using commentaries and reference works, and every now and then you'll come across scholarly works written using the principles of gematria. I'll admit they're rather rare, but I incorporate them in this module because I think they're so interesting. Now, if you'd like to read more along these lines, I would encourage you to read Richard Balcomb's The Testimony of the Beloved Disciple. Much of what I have presented here in this module I've taken from that book. But there's also an interesting book that you might want to look at. It's by a man by the name of M.J.J. Mencken, and the title of it is Numerical Literary Techniques in John, the Fourth Evangelist's Use of Numbers, of Words, and Symbols. It was published in 1985 by Brill. And let me tell you, Brill is among the most academic publishing companies that we have. It only publishes top-notch, first-rate, serious academic work. And so the fact that Mr. Mencken had his book published by Brill provides a great deal of academic credibility to his work. And so, yes, this can become too fanciful, this use of gematria. It can get carried away, I will admit, and people can start to see things that they just want to see there. Yes, all of that can happen. But it is still a very standard exegetical practice among the Jewish rabbis. And when serious-minded scholars, not sensationalists, but when serious-minded scholars use it, they can uncover some really rich, interesting insights, which I hope you have experienced in this module. Okay, thanks for your attention in this module. Of course, threaded discussion and a reading assignment before that. So until next time, goodbye and God bless.